Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today we are going to take a look at a British L96A1 sniper. This is the first sniper rifle, military sniper rifle, produced by Accuracy International, and it's a really cool, kind of a pioneer in modern sniper rifle development. So first off, this video is being done courtesy of Steve Houghton, who has published a book on British sniper rifles. So if you'd like to know more about this or any other British sniper rifle from, 1915 through basically 2018, definitely check it out. It is called The British Sniper, A Century of Evolution, and we'll have a link where you can pick it up in the description text below. So back to the rifle itself here. When Accuracy International got its start in the early 1980s, they were really kind of the stereotypical British company consisting of two guys in a shed. I shouldn't even say British, that's kind of stereotypical for a lot of small arms development. At any rate, they got their start manufacturing precision rifles for a British Olympic shooter by the name of Malcolm Cooper. And it was actually partly his activism that got these into military hands. And by 1984, Accuracy International had actually provided a small number of rifles to British Special Forces. And this is relevant because they got feedback from British Special Forces on tweaks and improvements and things that they could do to make these into better rifles that would serve them very well in the upcoming major British MOD trials. So in 1985, the British MOD decided to hold some trials to replace the L42 as its standard sniper rifle. The L42 was, quite literally, they were upgraded number 4 Mark 1T sniper rifles, which had been around since literally the 40s. This was kind of the old school of military sniper rifle, which was take your standard service rifle, pick the best, most accurate ones, and then mount scopes on them. That's basically the number 4T and then the L42. And the British, these rifles were getting older and they wanted something new. However, they weren't really expecting a fundamentally different rifle like Accuracy International provided. Anyway, AI gets this option to submit a rifle to MOD testing, and they weren't really optimistic about it. This wasn't like their big goal. They were a couple guys making competition rifles, and it appears that actually the mindset was, well, we might as well submit one. We won't win, but it'd be interesting to see our rifle go through a military trial and find out what bits we need to improve. This is something that we haven't really done on our own, and why not? What's the worst that could happen? Well, it turns out what actually happened was they won the trials. There were a number of other entrants. SIG was in there, HK was in there, Remington was in there, and then the major competitor that they had was Parker Hale that had submitted their M85 rifle for the trial. And ultimately it came down to a very close fought battle in the trial between the Parker Hale rifle and the Accuracy International rifle. And AI ended up winning out, although there were Parker Hale diehards probably still to this day. And what made this rifle different is that it was built on a chassis system. So what you see here looks a little bit unorthodox, and that's because every component on this rifle is modular. Instead of the classic traditional approach of you have a receiver and you screw a barrel into it and you put a trigger group on it and then you drop it into a stock and you bed it very nicely and that's your precision rifle. This instead has basically the receiver as the main element and everything else bolts separately onto the receiver. So when we take these stock sides off, which we'll do in just a moment, you'll see it's basically one big metal strut in here. The barrel is free-floated by nature of being completely independent from the stock, the furniture of the rifle. There's no need to bed anything because nothing actually touches here. And when it comes to military use, this was very practical because it meant that pretty much everything on the rifle was modular and independent. And there was almost nothing on here that could go wrong that you couldn't fix by removing the bad part and putting on a new functional part, as opposed to one of the old traditional types of rifles, which, if it gets damaged too badly, the whole thing has to go back to a workshop to be rebuilt. So it was that modularity, I think, that really gave Accuracy International the winning entrant in this competition. So in 1985, Accuracy International wins this trial, much to their surprise, and are left in a bit of a tight situation. It was a couple of guys in a shed. They didn't have any manufacturing capability, and in fact, they had so little industrial capability that they were really concerned that having won the trial, they might be disqualified from it simply for not being capable of producing rifles in quantity. So apparently there's this, I think, a really funny anecdote. And this comes, by the way, from Dave Walls, not directly, but indirectly, who was one of the principals in Accuracy International at the time. And I believe this is going to be in a book that he is in the process of writing on the history of the company. But apparently, having won the contract, the British MOD sent out a couple of officers to take a look at Accuracy International's factory, which of course didn't exist. And so the guys at AI rented a little industrial space in a little industrial park and kind of threw together a bunch of workbenches and some tools and some vices and scattered gun parts around to kind of make it sort of look like a working gun assembly shop. And they took these two MOD officers and brought them in and kind of ran them through it really quickly. Like, yeah, there's that and that and that and that, and let's go get lunch now. And dragged them out of the place over to lunch, desperately hoping that they wouldn't buy anything particularly expensive for lunch, because AI at the time did not have the budget or the money to provide much more than basically a beer and a sandwich. Fortunately, that's all these guys ended up wanting and getting. And as they left, one of the officers actually commented that, yeah, it looked great. We weren't really concerned. We just wanted to make sure you weren't just two guys in a shed, which is exactly what AI was at the time. So eventually this came to light because as a result of winning the contract, as a result of winning the trials, AI got a contract to make 1,112 of these rifles. They had been, by the way, designated the Accuracy International PM, the Practical Marksman rifle. And AI continued to sell the PM on the commercial market while this was all going on and afterwards. When the British military adopted the PM, they designated it the L96A1. So the two are actually identical rifles. They're the exact same thing. Because AI didn't have an actual factory to do this production, the British government gave a contract for it to a company called Pylon Engineering, which would prove to be a major problem in the story of this rifle and in its introduction and development. So the first 100 rifles, first 100 receivers were made by AI, by Dave Walls himself on his lathe in his garage. And that's actually one of the ones we have here is one of those first 100. We'll take a close look at it in a minute. After that, it went to Pylon because they were an established engineering company. They had tools, they had production facilities, and unfortunately, they were not really gun people. And they decided to take some liberties with some of the specifications, like this firing pin material spec. It's really far beyond what we need, and it's pretty expensive, and so let's just simplify it. There are a couple of, say, bolt holes in the back of the receiver that are supposed to be blind drilled. Well, threading blind holes is problematic. It's easy to break taps that way, so let's just drill them all the way through and it'll work fine. They made a couple of changes like that, and the one that would come back to really bite them was their change to the material specification of the firing pin, because just as these rifles were starting to be issued into the British military, the firing pins started breaking, and they would break just in front of the cocking piece, which is a particularly bad place with this rifle's design, because it meant that the firing pin spring was now pushing the firing pin forward, exposing the firing pin through the breech face, the bolt face, and not catching. When you closed the bolt, the striker wouldn't catch, or rather the back of the cocking piece would catch, but it was no longer connected to the front of the firing pin. And as you chambered a cartridge, the firing pin would contact the cartridge, the extractor would hold it into the breech face, and the cartridge would detonate out of battery, blowing the bolt back open. And a number of British troops were injured by rifles basically exploding out of battery this way, and it became an immediate and huge problem. In fact, for about 6 weeks, there was kind of this panicked look at how do we go back and modernize the L42 now? Because it looks like this L96 thing is a disaster that it's going to be gone. Like, do we still have some L42s? We didn't get rid of them yet, right? Let's make some brackets and attach night vision scopes to our L42s. what ended up happening was Accuracy International was put back in charge of overseeing all of the production of the rifles. Pylon ended up going out of business as a result of this debacle. And AI was able to fix the problem, identify what had been done, reverse it. In fact, the rifles were retrofitted with, and later ones modified with, an exposed firing pin. So you could see if there was going to be a problem like this. And within 6 weeks or so, the rifles were actually back into British service, which is a pretty remarkable turnaround. So looking at this from a mechanical perspective, aside from the chassis system, which I promise we'll take off in just a minute, there's not a whole lot of revolutionary. Well, there's nothing revolutionary about this. It is a kind of typical turn bolt system. We have a bolt release button back here on the side. Push that, can pull the bolt out. Got a 3-lug rotating bolt there. Note that the cocking piece extends out the back. That was the result of this product improvement after the debacle with broken firing pins. Originally, the very first guns, this was a completely enclosed shroud at the back. These are all chambered for the 7.62 NATO cartridge. That was, of course, the British standard sniping cartridge. That's what the L42 used. That's what these used. This has a double stack 10-round detachable box magazine. This has a number of features both for a military rifle and things that you would expect to see on a civilian competition rifle. Things like spacers on the butt pad, so you can adjust your length of pull by adding or removing these. There's a sling swivel back here, but there is also a small rear monopod leg, which if I loosen this thumb screw, that will come out. So not all that long, but you have a little bit there. If you're in a position where you can set this up on a 3-point fixed rest on your target, well, that makes it easy to do. It is spring-loaded, and this is an element that was improved in later rifles because it's a little bit tricky to put it back in. The trigger is a 2-stage trigger with a fantastic final light and crisp break. It's really an outstanding trigger. Nothing at all like what you get on an L42. This is much more reminiscent of a proper competition match rifle. Again, like you would see on a match rifle, you have a sling swivel here for a shooting sling that can be adjusted for position or removed altogether if you don't want it. And a nice robust bipod at the front of the rifle. It's a fairly wide bipod, which is nice. The legs can extend out, like so. And if you don't want the bipod on, you can rotate it out and simply remove it entirely from the gun. However, while we're talking about cool modern modular features, you will notice that the muzzle is not threaded, doesn't have a flash hider. It doesn't really need a flash hider because of its length, but it was not threaded, which is something that would be quite remarkably odd today. Remember, this is basically the first of the modern era of military sniper rifles, and so the idea of adding a suppressor on there or any sort of other device wasn't really something people were thinking about. They did go ahead and put an iron sight on it, a rather substantial iron sight. You can zero this quite effectively. That's your backup sight. We'll take a look at the front iron sight right now. In order to get to the rear iron sight, we have to take off the scope. That's held in place by 2 thumb screws here. And this just pops off. So there's a rail milled down the length of the top of the receiver, and we have an oval hole right here in conjunction with this peg. That's what gives you your repeatable 0. You can drop the scope on, line it up so that that peg is in place. You have a little bit of play, so you push it to the back, which is where recoil will pull it anyway, and then tighten it down, and you do actually have a very effective repeatable 0 from this. A lot of people think that a repeatable 0 is this mysterious thing that requires all sorts of extra levers and controls and quadruple locking things to get right. In reality, a repeatable 0 is gotten based on mechanical precision of the manufacturer of the parts. And one of the things that AI did was they brought basically a custom rifle level of precision to a mass-produced military sniper rifle. Here's our rear backup iron sight, which is a pretty sophisticated backup sight. You could actually, I suspect, shoot this quite well and effectively using just this sight. So it lifts up, of course, and then it is adjustable for elevation. It is an aperture sight, and we have our adjustment dial right there. You can also adjust it for windage. Now that we have the scope off, I can also show you the markings on the receiver. The company name, Accuracy International England. Above that, we have what is basically a part identification number for the gun, CR138GA, and then rifle, 7.62mm L96A1. This is one of the very early guns. In fact, once production really got into the swing of things, the markings would improve. They'd standardize them a little bit better. You can see that this looks a little more nicely done. The marking's the same, however, they have now added the British NSN number to it as well. And this one is actually a police-issued rifle. This was used by the Bedfordshire Police, and it is a 1989 production. You'll notice it has a PM prefix, and that is that Precision Marksman, which is AI's commercial name for this rifle. And this one is serial number 0576. So that's one of the places you'll see a difference between the military and the civilian or police production guns. Now, of course, optics are as important as the rifle on a platform like this. The original L96A1 optic was a Schmidt and Bender, specifically a fixed 6-power by 42mm optic. See that there, painted green to match the scope. And in fact, you can tell this is kind of early production because it's still marked West Germany manufacture. If we look on the bottom of the rear objective, you'll have AI's serial number. So this one is not actually matching to the rifle, but because of the level of precision in the mounting and the fabrication of these guns, that really wasn't all that important. At times you could conceivably even interchange these scopes without having to re-zero, or with an absolutely minimal re-zero necessary. So swapping scopes around really wasn't that big of a deal. On the elevation dial of the scope, you'll find two sets of numbers. The top number, in basically white and black, is your BDC. So that is your distance in hundreds of meters, and you can set to that. Or you can use the yellow numbers at the bottom, which are adjustment in minutes of angle. So you have you have 1 minute clicks on this, which another interesting aspect of being the first of the modern sniper rifles. We would think today of 1 minute of angle clicks as like hopelessly coarse. And people are expecting quarter minute or even 1/8 minute adjustments on scopes. But 1985, this is what was being done, and this was suitable for the military. You'll see that the windage knob is similarly marked. We also have 1 minute of angle adjustment clicks for the windage. The L96 remained in British service for quite some time, and right around the invasion of Iraq, some of the British snipers who had these rifles started complaining that the 6-power scope really wasn't sufficient. Like, this was kind of outdated. And so right about that time, the guns went through a bit of a midlife upgrade process, and they replaced the optics with a different Schmidt and Bender. So they now have a 3-12 by 50, a variable power optic, which offers both a lower magnification for a greater field of view and better target acquisition, as well as double the magnification at the high end if you want it, and a larger lens for better light gathering. The original scopes had been designated L13. I should have mentioned that. This was the L96A1, and this was actually taken off of the Accuracy International Arctic Warfare rifles, the L118 rifles that were in service with the British, some parts of the British military by that time. So this was a scope that was already in service and available, and so it uses a slightly different mount, but it can drop onto the L96 rifle, and this was a substantial increase in effectiveness for the gun. By this point, we no longer have minutes of angle for adjustments. We now have milliradians, mils, and however, you'll notice that while we have mils on the bottom, we still have your BDC numbers also listed. So you can now adjust this in 1/10 of a mil increments, or set it to specific holdovers. The windage is also now set in 1/10 of a mil clicks. You have a focal range adjustment, And this scope would actually have a mil-dot reticle, and it is a first focal plane reticle. So as you adjust the magnification of the scope here, your reticle shifts with it so that your mil-dots are usable at any magnification. There's also a range-finding element to the reticle, a pair of horizontal lines. The idea is a man-sized object, a human being, will go from the waist at the bottom line to the top of the head at the top line. And those four different increments there are 400, 600, 800, and 1,000 meters. And those also shift as you adjust the magnification of the scope, so usable at any magnification. Over time, the reticle was actually developed or improved, especially by Special Forces units. And this is the 6-power fixed scope, but with the improved reticle. And then here is the L17 reticle, mil-dot with the rangefinders. And by the way, in order to mount this, you actually have to take the iron sights off the rifle because it's just a longer scope base. So by this point in the rifle's development, the iron sights were not considered as necessary, and the rifles lost them in that midlife upgrade. All right, I promised I would show you what this looks like with the side panels taken off, and there it is. This is actually our police sniper here, but exactly the same. So instead of having a stock that the receiver drops into, you have this long solid metal, this is aluminum, basically strut or chassis, into which every component simply bolts. So the receiver is bolted on here, trigger group is bolted on through the strut. The side panels of the stock, it's almost a little odd to call it a stock because it's really just like rifle cladding. You've got two of these guys, one goes on each side, and you can see where the strut fits right here. These two sides simply mate up with each other. The screws, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 screws that hold these onto the rifle don't actually screw into the chassis. They go through it, and the screw attaches into the opposite side panel. So you can't over tighten this and like adjust modify any of the harmonics of the rifle because these holes are oversized, and no matter how tight you put this on, you're not going to mess up the fine aspects of your zero. Incidentally, one of the issues with these is when you take these off the rifle, they're apparently extremely fragile. It's not an issue when they're bolted on because there's no way for them to flex, but these were made of resin and when removed are quite delicate. And that was something that would be upgraded in later rifles, the Arctic Warfare series that would build on the original PM. There's a bit of a close-up of the receiver segment for you. I guess the one piece that is sort of integral to the chassis is the magazine well, because it's just a hole in the chassis with a spring and a release lever pinned into it. One of the other weak points in the gun, such as there were weak points in the gun, is this joint at the back, which is a welded joint. And apparently AI actually had some trouble with the fabrication in this area. Because aluminum is really kind of obnoxiously difficult to weld, they had overall length issues with forming that joint. And so in later iterations, after they got done with the military contract, they would change this to basically be pinned together so that you didn't have any issues of the weld melting more or less metal and adjusting the overall length. There's your block at the front end for holding the bipod. And you can see quite clearly how the barrel doesn't touch this chassis at all. So the thing is free floated automatically, doesn't require bedding, doesn't require any fancy special preparation of any sort. I didn't mention the safety earlier because we have a really good view of it here. This is the fire position, and that's the safe position. And it's all it does is we have a flat surface there that allows the striker to go past, and a higher surface there that prevents it from going past. Simplicity is what makes things, simplicity is the goal in a rifle like this. One of the cool facts, little anecdotes to me that really highlights the increased capability of this rifle, the L96, over what had previously just essentially been upgraded Lee Enfields, is that with the L42, the rifle was considered to have a deadly effective range of 600 meters and a harassing range of 800 meters. And with this rifle, firing the same cartridge, those ranges were increased out to 900 yards of lethal effectiveness and 900 meters and 1,100 meters of effective harassing fire, just because the rifle was so much easier to use and so much more accurate. At the same time, the Royal Marines, who had been running basically the sniper training courses for all of the British military units, they didn't change their sniper training course when the L96 came into service. It didn't really occur to anyone that there was a reason to. But what they found was that the passing rate, the number of students in the class who actually passed the course, skyrocketed with the adoption of this rifle, because it was just so much easier to be effective with this compared to the old L42 Enfields, that guys were massively more effective with it. Along the same lines, it highlighted some shortcomings in some of the other sniper equipment, things like the spotting scopes that were issued out to sniper spotters were 20 power magnification, and the snipers began to complain that basically they were able to make effective hits out to distances beyond where their spotters were able to be effective. So that led to a search for new spotting scopes, and sort of this every aspect of the British sniping program all of a sudden had to be improved just to keep up with the capabilities of their new rifle. For the record, the police rifle that you see there was retrofitted with a military barrel by a collector. This is the original police barrel. So instead of having a front sight, or a rear sight for that matter, the rifles that were purchased by British police agencies had this kind of interesting spiral curved flash hider at the front. So in total, 1,247 of these rifles were built and supplied to the UK military, with the last ones produced in 1992. They would become known by the British military as the Green Meanie, because of course, the green color, and would have a fantastically successful service life. They would serve actively in pretty much every conflict that the British military got into until 2012. Their replacement was actually adopted a few years earlier in 2008, and they were phased out in 2012. We will touch on the replacement for this rifle in a future video. In addition to the military rifle, of course, there were a handful of these made for the police, not very many, and basically the same gun. The barrel was a little bit different, as you saw, and the scopes were a little bit different as well, but the functional bits, the gun itself, was the same. When these went out of service, they were put into storage for a couple of years, and then the ultimate fate of the L96s, unfortunately, was in 2014 and 2015. They were cut up into pieces, and then all the pieces dumped in the North Sea. The British Ministry of Defence was apparently very concerned to make sure that nothing of this project survived. So there are only a very small number of guns like this one that managed to escape that destruction through various circuitous routes. This one, I believe, had been used as a testing platform for new optics, and so had kind of gotten its way out of the standard British inventory system and was disposed of onto the civilian market. So I think it's one of two military provenance L96s that survive in private hands today. There are a couple others in various collections. The MOD did give a couple to different organizations under the condition that they could never be sold. But outside of the British military, these weren't adopted by anybody else, except I think Ireland. But there was not a widespread international use of the L96. Now, this rifle would end up being basically the proving bed for what would become AI's Arctic warfare rifle, developed for Sweden. We'll touch on that in a future video as well. And that rifle would see a lot more international use, and it's a lot more common. But the L96 is today an extremely scarce military rifle. So like I said at the beginning, if you're interested in this subject, definitely take a look at Steve Houghton's book on the British Sniper, A Century of Evolution. There's a lot more discussion of this, including some of the ancillary items, the transit cases, the spotting scopes, the changes to the optic, a lot more detail.